We'll just quickly introduce ourselves. We'll be taking the webinar today on research methods, and we are part of the SAM Lab. So my name is Manushi.
And I'm Trey.
Hi. So yeah, we can go ahead and start. So it's gonna be a very quick crash course on research methods. So um, we'll start with. Great. So today's agenda is we'll talk about how to generate a strong research question and come up with hypotheses that we can actually test. So this is essentially about generating, looking at your variables and seeing how we can operationalize them. What that means, I'll show you later in the webinar. And then also choosing what study designs to use as part of your study and what statistical tests you can use. So it's basically a crash course for your entire research progress. Um, yeah, so first we'll talk about what your research question should be. So it should be clear, focused, arguable, feasible, and substantive. So I'll tell you about, we'll go through an example research question. So for example, you're testing how the sleep you get the night before impacts your test scores, right? Um, or you're picking like social media use. So generally you pick a broader topic called social media use, and then what you're essentially trying to do is narrow down that topic into something you can measure. So you narrow it down to parents' social media use, and then you're also asking you're you also have to figure out what exactly are you asking about social media use. So is it about what social media they use, how they use it, when they use it? Those are all interesting questions, right? So you have to pick out of all these questions. So like think about all of these: what, why, who, when, where, how. You can practically make a question out of each of these things. In this particular example, we're talking about how do parents use social media, and then additionally, how does that affect the children's development? So here, something to make sure is that we know what our IV and DVs are. IV and DV is independent variable and dependent variable. So in this case, whatever is um, the thing that we're manipulating is the independent variable. So assuming that parents use social media differently, that is the thing that's having an effect on something. So that is going to be our independent variable. Whereas the thing that's being affected on, I guess, um, is our dependent variable, which is going to be children's development. So whatever the thing that is being affected is the dependent variable. So we have, let's say we pick the question, does social media use of parents affect children's development? Now we have to make this question even more focused. So let's talk about the details. So for example, so you said social media, right? But then how do you operationalize social media? Because social media is an abstract concept right now. So we need to figure out ways in which that um, we can measure social media. So one way of measuring social media is screen time, right? So screen time is a good objective measure of looking at how much a parent uses social media. Then we have to narrow down other details, like, okay, if we are looking at the effect on children's development, what does that mean? How old are the children? So let's we look at the literature on what we consider the prime period for development, and that happens to be 11 to 14 years. And then what do we consider development? So basically we're picking apart parts of the question, and we're asking what exactly are we going to measure for this particular variable. um, and for development, we might use development of communication effectiveness. So how well are they able to communicate? Because development includes a bunch of different things like emotional development, communication development. um, Yeah, so then the research question goes from just like broadly, how does parents' social media affect children's development, to does limiting parents' screen time for Instagram increase the communication effectiveness of children's ages between 11 to 14? So you see how we went from like a broader question to a much narrower question. So basically, what we did was we broke down each concept within the research question, and then we saw how we are going to measure them, right? And to have concrete research questions, it's good to have only one variable that affects another variable. It gets a little bit more messy and tricky when you have multiple variables affecting other variables, right? Another thing to make sure is we are never saying that this causes that, because when we are doing like research designs which are correlational, um, where we are like using like screen time and stuff, and a questionnaire for development, that is a correlational research. So because we haven't done a real experiment, we can't really say that this, like, assuming that parents use a lot of social media, it causes any changes in development. We can always say that it strongly affects it, but we can't say that it causes. Yeah, so now we get to the hypothesis. The hypothesis is basically you predicting what will happen. Here, just now, I predicted that parents using more social media would negatively affect the development. So it's always going to be a directional hypothesis, which means that we always have to, basically, you're asking yourself, what do you think is going to happen? That's essentially your hypothesis. Is going to be a clear, focus, and feasible hypothesis, so that when you say that high social media use would lead to negative communication, you're making it very clear so that when you actually get your results, you can cross verify from your hypothesis if it was correct or not, right? So if your hypothesis is general, like, yes, social media use will affect children's development, that's too general. That's not focused enough, because it, I mean, it could affect, yes, but it could positively affect or negatively affect. The more precise your hypothesis is, the better you are at this, at doing research, essentially. Which is we are trying to falsify ourselves. So we're trying to first initially start by saying that there is no effect of social media use on children's development, and then if we do find if we do find an effect, then we can say that this was the direction of the effect, so either positive or negative, and the fact that there was an effect. So we start by saying that there was no effect, which is your null hypothesis. Right, so our hypothesis is like amongst children ages 11 to 14, the parents who impose a 30-minute daily screen time limit for Instagram exhibit higher communication skills than children's parents who do not. This is a very strong hypothesis because it makes it even more focused of a 30-minute daily screen time. So we can actually go into our data and see if parents who impose a 30-minute daily screen time limit see better communication habits in their children, right? And a lot of your hypothesis is based on your previous literature review, so you should remember that. Okay, yes, this is another example of hypothesis. So this is a general research question called, are test scores impacted by the amount of sleep the night before the test? And then the hypothesis is, which is a more focused one, those who sleep for more than 8 hours a night, those who slept for more than 8 hours the night before a test score significantly higher than those who slept less than 8 hours, which is good because then we can see the 8 hour mark and we can see how people perform before and after 8 hours. Yeah. Now, Trey will take over this particular section.
Thanks, Manushi. Great job. And so now that we've come up with a good research question and a hypothesis that we want to test, it's important to think about how we're actually going to go about testing that hypothesis. And there's three ways that we're going to talk about here, that being descriptive research, correlational research, and experimental research. Descriptive research is when you're just really observing or you want to see how something interacts by itself. You're not really making any comparisons to look at a IV versus a DV. You think kind of like a case study where you're really just going to watch how one individual does things or mark down their characteristics, but you're not really answering the how or why. Correlational research, we're looking at statistical relationships, so associations. We may want to look at how one variable predicts another. Like, does how fast you drive predict the number of car accidents that there are? That would be an example of correlational research. Then we also have experimental research, and this really gets at the causal effect of think about how correlational research, we're talking about one thing predicting another, but we're not really explaining whether that actually causes it. It's just an association. Experimental research, we can get at causality by having different groups, like a control group versus a experimental group looking at a DV. So you think of like you have one person that has a drug administered and one person that's in a placebo group, and we want to see whether or not our drug was effective. That would be an example of experimental research. And so, how do we know which one of these to pick? It kind of depends on what question we're trying to answer. Do we care about causality? Do we just want to look at correlations? Or do we just kind of want to observe a phenomenon and write down what we see? And then, how practical is it? Given our resources, maybe that can be funding, or do we have access to a lab? Does it have to be online? There are a lot of considerations in how practical a research question can actually be. And then, how will we collect our data? Is it going to be descriptive? Are we writing stuff down? Are we collecting numbers? So we want to administer surveys. These are all variables that we want to consider when we're thinking about how to decide our experimental design or research design. And so there are a few different ways to collect data that are common in psychology. We use survey data, observational data, and physiological data. Survey data is probably something a lot of you have been exposed to. It's just administering surveys that kind of just assess how people feel. So you can give someone a stress scale and it's just asking how many times in the last 10 days have you felt this emotion? Or we think of Likert scales where it's like, I'm very likely to do something, very unlikely to do something. All of those would fall under the category of survey data. Observational data kind of goes along with that descriptive research that we were talking about, where you're not really bringing anyone into a laboratory setting, but you're just observing the way that they interact in nature and then marking it down. So no survey is administered, and we're not like measuring their heart rate or something like that. That would be more of like physiological data, which is rather than just asking someone how they feel, we're going to take actual measurements. So you think of a heart rate monitor for stress or like cortisol levels to measure stress or like measuring somebody's pulse ox or something of that nature. So you're taking a real physiological biometric number and you're collecting that as data rather than just a survey or an observation. So now that we've collected our data, how are we going to analyze it? And there are a few different ways that we're going to talk about today on how we statistically test hypotheses. If we want to compare group means, so say we have that control group and experimental group, and we want to look at the difference in the efficacy of a drug, you could do an independent samples t-test. So you're going to be comparing the mean of your control group to your experimental group. Whereas in a paired samples t-test, we have time one and time two that we're comparing over time. So you may want to look at, say, how somebody did on a pre-test or their health before we administered the drug, and then how was their health afterwards. So you're really observing the same person, but before and after they go through a condition. Whereas with ANOVA, that's another way to compare means, very simple to an independent or similar to an independent samples t-test, but instead of just comparing two groups, like your experimental group and your control group, you have more than two. So you could have your experimental group, your control group, and then a group who went through the experiment, but it was a much more lengthy one, or it varied slightly from your other experimental condition. And those would be just examples of comparing group means. For correlational research, we're really just looking at associations between things. So we're not really simply comparing means. Like we mentioned before with car accidents, we may want to say, does speeding predict whether or not someone will get into a car accident? So you could just look at the correlation between the speed that someone was going and the number of accidents that occurred. So we kind of just think of like typical correlations you see on scatter plots or something of that nature. A chi-square is a different example of correlational research where you're looking at the frequency at which something occurred between multiple categories. So we may want to look at smokers and non-smokers, and then whether or not they have good health or poor health. And then we want to see, well, are there more smokers in our healthy category or in our non-healthy category, and then make comparisons that way. There are also some additional things to note about research design and things that you may want to consider. Do you want to do quantitative research or qualitative research? Quantitative research is going to be much more numbers or statistical or mathematically heavy, where you're kind of trying to test a hypothesis, and you will need a larger sample to do that. So in quantitative research, it once again may be like those associations that we're looking at. We want to see, does something predict another? Is one drug more effective than another? Something of that nature. Whereas qualitative research, we're more focused on words and meanings and understanding phenomena and use smaller, more in-depth samples for our studies. So rather than giving someone a scale that says, rate 1 to 10 how you felt when you woke up this morning, you could just give them a prompt saying, how did you feel when you woke up this morning? And then you can analyze their response and just kind of see the differences that people are writing down. So obviously you would be able to do that with a smaller group, as it would take much more time to analyze a whole paragraph rather than just gathering a number from a scale. And there's also, so now that we've gone through all that, we have a couple of helpful tips for finding a good source for developing both your research question and your hypothesis. First, you may want to identify keywords. So these are specific words or synonyms that are related to the research question to broaden your search. So basically, you're thinking of like words that are really related to the question that I have in mind. So like depression, I want to look at uh, research that has to do with depression. That may be a keyword, or look at words that are similarly related to that. You also want to use academic databases, so Google Scholar, PubMed, PsycInfo. So we're making sure that we're getting high quality articles rather than just relying on like a news source like CNN, NBC, or Fox News. We really want to just use academic databases to receive primary sources. Also, that goes along with evaluating your sources. So you want to make sure that even within academic databases, you're getting articles that are credible in peer-reviewed journals. So you don't want to get anything from, say, like a predatory journal that's not really peer-reviewed. You want to make sure that you're getting good scientific articles if you're going to cite those as your sources. Also, you want to make sure you can access full text. The ASU library is a good resource for getting access to full text through a lot of different of databases that we've talked about, but also it's important to make sure that you're not just reading an abstract and then citing something. So you really want to read an abstract just to check if a source is relevant to you rather than to just read it and say, oh, okay, so this is saying exactly what I need and then citing it immediately. And finally, we want to organize our references. So there are tools for this like EndNote, Zotero, or Mendeley. And I personally use Zotero, as you can pull up an article and or a PDF in your web browser, then just click the button on your browser and it'll automatically save the citation for you and it will put them in alphabetical order. And here's some online search modifiers you can use when you're making like keyword searches within one of these databases that we've talked about. You can use and in all caps, and it will make sure that it looks for both of the terms that you put in rather than just one. So if you were to look at, say, depression, capital and anxiety, it would only include resources that talk about both rather than just one or the other. You can also, on the other hand, use or the minus, which will then tell it to exclude the terms following the minus. So if I want only depression but not anxiety, I could put depression minus anxiety. And then quotation marks allow you, similarly to the way they work on Google, where it just gives you exactly whatever you put in there. So if you want to look at, say, ADHD but not ADD, you would put quotations around ADHD and it would include all sources that have that wording in them verbatim. So this is a good way that we can evaluate the credibility of one of our sources, examine it thoroughly. Is it a book, a website article, a research paper? Is it the type of source that we feel like meets the criteria for the type of paper that we're writing? Who is our author? Is the author an expert in the field? Is it a news reporter, a publisher? Let's make sure that we're getting like good authorship before we cite a source. What type of website does it come from? Is it an edu or an org? So is our website coming from an institution or is it just like .com or .net? And then is it up to date? So you want to check your publication date, especially if you're researching something that's relatively been around for a relatively long time. You want to make sure that you're using the most up-to-date research possible so that you're staying on top of what's currently going on within any type of field that you're interested in. And so here's a couple of techniques for reading those sources. You can skim. So skimming allows you to read pretty quickly. You just read the first sentence or paragraph of each paragraph to get a quick understanding of what it's going to be about. Whereas scanning is where you just kind of put your eyes up and down a page and spot like keywords that you're interested in looking for that are related to your topic. So these are pretty some good ways to kind of make sure an article is relevant to what you want to talk about without having to invest the time to just fully read an entire 15-page article. So that's it. That's the last of our tips. Thanks for coming, and we'll have an activity following.
Yeah, so this was the end of the kind of like going through all the topics that we had as part of the webinar. And now we have a little bit of an interactive activity of trying to build a research question ourselves. So, from the people who are here, so we have four variables that we have randomly picked for this particular activity: sleep, social media use, mental health, and memory. Now, what we want you to do is pick any two variables from this list and build a research question. You can pick any two, and then we'll build it together. So, I'm just going to give you 2 minutes to pick your variable and come up with something that you want to test between those two. So one should affect the other one. So everyone in the meeting can select the two variables and maybe write them in the chat, or you're free to unmute yourself and speak. That'll be great, actually. Um, and let's build a research question ourselves. So anyone has a suggestion for two variables that they want to pick? Take some time. Um, can you open the chat in the thing? Okay, awesome. So we have sleep and memory. Someone picked that. Do we have any other combinations of ideas? We'll go through all of them. So, someone picked sleep and memory. What are the other ideas people have? What is tech? What do you generally do research on?
Me?
Yeah.
I look at ADHD
Okay,
and
great.
social media use.
Okay, that's cool. Okay, Clay says mental health and social media use. Nice. Mental health and memory. Okay, what do you wanna go with?
I like I like mental health and social media use. I feel like
Okay.
everybody that's a hot
That's
topic
a
right
hot
now.
topic. That's good. Okay, so maybe we can go ahead with mental health and social media use. And also people can stick to their own variables. We'll make research questions for all of them. Okay. So assuming we are working with mental health and social media use, what exactly as part of mental health do we want to test,
Yeah.
right?
So you start broad and then you kind of
Yeah,
narrow it down.
yeah. So Clay, let me ask you, what part of mental health are you interested in? Are you interested in a particular um like, are you interested in depression, anxiety, ADHD? Like you can pick one of those things that interests you the most. And not even those things. You can pick something out of the other three too. And like other people can also pick on behalf. Um Okay, awesome. Self-esteem and ADHD. That's interesting.
That's a good one.
That's a good one. Okay, that's cool. So, okay, we can stick with anxiety and also we can work on self-esteem and ADHD. Okay, so let's start with anxiety.
Okay.
So, we are testing anxiety on, we're testing the level of anxiety okay, so we can go both ways.
Hmm.
Are we testing social effect of social media use on anxiety, or are we testing how much anxiety do you already have and its effect on how much social media do you use, right? um so what do you want to do? What is our IV and what is our DV? Let's say we are picking anxiety.
You want to use anxiety as IV or DV?
Yeah, so I'm asking them if they want to use anxiety as the one, as a thing that people have, or are we testing the effect on anxiety? Maybe we can do the effect of social media use on anxiety, or maybe
It works either way.
trade anxiety. Yeah, I mean
Yeah,
it works.
it's been
It works
researched both
both
ways.
ways.
Yeah.
It's true. Okay, what about like self-esteem? Do you think what would have a bigger effect?
It would make more sense to look at ADHD predicting self-esteem.
ADHD predicting self-esteem.
Yeah. That's one way to think about like if you're thinking about your variables
Right.
because ADHD is you're born with it.
Right,
So
right,
it's
right,
not
right.
you could think about how bad it's going to get if something else is co-occurring, but
Right, right,
usually
right.
it's going to predict other things.
Okay, okay. So, so for that question, we'll use your level of ADHD traits and that affecting your self-esteem.
Mhm.
And then for the anxiety bit, we can maybe see how anxious you are and that affecting the amount of social
Social media
media you
that you
use.
use, yeah.
Okay, cool. So, okay, so let's define these variables, right? So, for the anxiety one, we are testing how much anxiety do people have, right? So, what should we use for that? Should we do like what can we use to measure anxiety?
Well, if you think about like the three different measures that we talked about, you
Right.
could use a physiological measure, like
Mm-hmm.
heart rate, maybe.
Yeah.
You could use a scale, so like a perceived stress scale,
Right.
and ask them just self-report how anxious are you, basically.
Nice. Okay.
Or you could just put them into a situation like, say, public speaking,
Yeah,
and
and
you
that
just
would,
write down like what you notice about how they're acting. That'd be like three different ways that you
okay.
could just measure, or you could use all three at the same time
That is
and
true.
just see.
So when you use three things at the same time, that's also called triangulation.
Mm.
So you're basically combining different methods together to work. Now, assuming I don't have funding, right? I don't have money to do this research. I don't have participants who are willing to go on a stage and speak, and I don't have, let's say, like physiological measures in my hand. What
Mhm.
can I use that is feasible?
Then most likely you just want to use a survey because you can do it
Right.
online. You don't have to fly people or have people come into your
Yeah,
lab. You
yeah,
can
yeah.
just send it to them via a website and they can just fill out a survey for you.
Okay, perfect. So we have a survey for perceived anxiety. And then how are we measuring social media use?
That's a good question. You could just ask them how much are
Right.
you on social media every day. I know
Yeah.
if you have an iPhone, you have the
Yeah,
ability to
screen
just
time.
screen time, just look at their
What are
screen.
the other ways that other people can think that we can measure social media use? It doesn't need to be screen time. It can also, we can also ask them how much they use social media, right? Like a Likert scale? Yeah, like a
Yeah.
Likert scale. A lot of scales, most of the scales that you will use within psychological research is going to be a Likert scale, because it gives you like, it assumes that you're asking someone from a range of different options. So you can see the level of the thing that you're asking. So the level of anxiety, from a bunch of questions. And you're likely to use scales that other people have used before,
Exactly.
because those scales, the fact that been used before, are validated and more reliable than a scale that like someone came up with like
Hmm.
a year ago.
Especially for a really common thing like anxiety, there are like gold standards of scales that you know if I give this to all my people, then it's probably going to give me back good data.
Yeah, right. So, okay, so let's assume that we are using the perceived anxiety scale, and then we are asking people for their screen time, but we're also asking them how much they use their phones.
Mm.
So we're collecting two different measures of, I mean, you can collect multiple measures of the same thing, right? So in this case, the anxiety is just one measure, which is a scale, but you're collecting two measures of social media use. One is the screen time, and the other one is just asking them again as a question how much social media they use. And we can actually see if they match, right? Like
Hmm.
how much social media they think they use and how much they actually use. Um, okay, so we have these two things. Now let's build a question. So we know that, do you think having high anxiety will lead to more social media use, or having less anxiety will lead to more social
So
media use?
formulating the hypothesis,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
you would think that high anxiety would lead to increased use of social media.
Okay, okay. So what is your like logic behind that?
That when you're anxious, you may be less likely to interact outwardly and have more of a tendency to use your phone as a coping mechanism to avoid stress.
Right. Yeah, yeah. That makes sense. So like the logic behind your hypothesis a lot of the time will come from the literature. So when you're gathering literature, you're basically collecting, okay, this person has looked at the fact that anxious people tend to be on their phones, the fact that not interact with other people, right? What happens when you not don't interact with other people? An alternative is that you go on your phone. So like you are supposed, as a researcher, you're supposed to make these connections between the literature that you see online. And then so you think high anxiety would lead to high social media use. So what do you consider as high social media use?
Interesting. I guess that depends on how you want to look at it.
Okay, so like maybe a study that you read online said that the average social media use is around 4 hours a day.
That'd be pretty high, but
That is,
yeah.
I guess maybe it's 2 hours a day. Let's be optimistic. It's 2 hours a day.
Hmm.
What would be considered as high social media use?
There's a few, it's hard to say. There's a few ways that you could figure it out. So you
Mm-hmm.
could go look and read articles
Mm-hmm.
and say, well, what other people are looking like, what do they find? Like, what's the average?
Nice,
And
yeah.
then you could look at maybe a Z-score and then
Mm-hmm.
see how, like, are my people like way above average? Are they
Mm-hmm.
low average? Basically, you can make it dependent on previous literature or just dependent on the sample that you have.
Right. Yeah. So we can, so obviously the way he said, we can, one is looking at previous literature, we can make a cutoff before we collect data, right? So maybe a paper that I've read says that anything above 6 hours is high, right? Or anything above 5 hours is high. So I'm setting a cutoff that that high anxiety score above this that I find in my literature will lead to a high social media use above 5 hours.
Mhm.
So that's a precise hypothesis that you can test. The other way you can go is that you can first collect your data. You can say high social media time, right? You can first collect your data and then you look at your own data. You don't look at any previous sample. Look at your own data and then look at your mean. What is the average social media time within your sample? Because your sample might not be representative of everyone
No.
who's ever used social media, right? So you look at your own sample and then you can make cutoffs within your sample. So you have your mean and then you have your high condition, which is like maybe two standard deviations away from the mean, and then you have your low cutoff, which is two standard deviation this side of the mean, and that makes your high and low social media time. That's one way, that's two
Yeah,
ways you can
definitely.
do this. And I think that's pretty much it. And then you go out and you conduct the survey, you ask them for people's social media time, and then what tests would be used for this?
Analyze the data. You could use a t-test for this. You
Right.
do just
So,
say is my high anxiety people significantly different than my low anxiety people
right.
in the
Yeah.
amount of social media that they're using.
Right. So we would use we would use an independent sample t-test, right?
Yeah.
Because the high anxiety people are a different bunch of people, and then the low anxiety people are the different bunch of people.
Hmm.
And if let's assume that you're doing like an intervention where you're seeing how this particular like social media blocking app reduces social media time, right?
Yeah.
So, and maybe this social media blocking app, how does that reduce anxiety? So then how would you go about that?
That would be working the other way. So you'd be looking at social media time predicting someone's anxiety. So you could say,
Yeah,
if I reduce someone's social media, does it
yeah,
also reduce their anxiety?
yeah,
So that would
yeah,
be a good way to check, does it work both
yeah,
directions?
that's true. So you would probably like get the social media times before the app that they started using. Then they use the app for like, let's say a week, and then you collect their social media time after. And then that would be a pair T test because then you're checking their own social media time before and after
Before
the
and after. Exactly.
app. Okay, yeah, so that's how you build a research question. I hope this was helpful because we were like trying to go through the process of thinking about a research question. If you guys want to build or discuss a research question that you have come up with yourselves, we are open to doing that. You can stick around. This is probably the end of the workshop, but if you have a research question that you are building yourself, then we can figure it out also. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming and attending the workshop. Bye bye.